Biases are often unintentional. Unconscious biases are formed about certain groups of people that individuals from outside their own conscious awareness. They are shaped by broad cultural and social norms and stereotypes. Sometimes bias is a result of not recognizing how different groups have privilege as a result of their gender or race or sexual orientation, while others face barriers. And the saying, "birds of a feather flock together," is an apt description of the tendency to be more comfortable with others who look and think like us. This can, however, create barriers to people who are not like us. Biases are not just an issue at the individual level. They can become embedded in systems and policies and processes in ways that lead to discrimination. The Harvard Implicit Bias Test provides excellent insights into how bias shows up. Often, when we are under pressure or making snap decisions, we fall back on assumptions and stereotypes. While bias is deeply ingrained, we can do something about it by being more self-reflective and challenging our assumptions. The first step is to become more aware of how your background and experience may have given you privileges you are unaware of, and also shaped your assumptions about others. The Privilege Checklist and Harvard Implicit Bias Test are good places to start. The next is to become more aware about how bias affects other people, both at the individual and systemic levels. There are lots of good resources available to help explore these ideas. For example, while overt discrimination is direct and intentional, microaggressions are a form of discrimination which occurs as part of routine interactions. Comments, jokes, language, behaviors which reinforce stereotypes and marginalize people, whether intentional or not. They are often subtle, unintentional, and products of stereotypes. What is worse about microaggressions is that it is often hard for the victim to tell if it was deliberate, intentional, or they're just being overly sensitive. This ambiguity is actually even more damaging and has been compared to death by 1,000 cuts. The Micropedia is a tool developed by Zulu Alpha Kilo, the Diversity Institute, and a number of community partners, which is intended to help you understand microaggressions. For example, attempting to compliment a racialized person or a newcomer with, "You speak good English," or "You are so articulate," are microaggressions. This is because these sayings could be interpreted as, "Who would have thought that someone of your race could be so articulate?" Or, "Your group is usually less intelligent than you." The problem is pervasive. In a recent survey of Black Canadians, nearly a third have continued to experience microaggressions and racism at work, including 14% who say it has actually increased in the past year. In 2020, 1 in 4 women reported having experienced inappropriate sexualized behaviors at work in the last year. 40% of Indigenous employees experience discrimination in the workplace because of their Indigenous identity. This rises to 50% for First Nations employees. Furthermore, Indigenous women are more likely to experience discrimination in the workplace than Indigenous men. But left unchecked, biases can become embedded in organizational processes that are taken for granted and are rarely re-examined. When this happens, they become organizational biases that shape workplace culture. These biases can reinforce systemic discrimination, which exclude and negatively impact people, and undermine any efforts to drive workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion. Organizational biases can significantly influence hiring outcomes, employee satisfaction and retention, and ultimately, engagement and organizational performance. Not only is it important to be conscious of our biases, but to recognize them in the behaviors of others, and to not be a bystander when we witness them. For example, in hiring committees, you might observe bias in comments about how a Canadian-born candidate is a better fit than someone who was born outside of Canada for a new position, despite both having similar qualifications and experiences. Often, men are asked questions based on their potential, while women have to demonstrate a track record. Or when a woman makes a suggestion which is ignored, and a man is lauded for making the same recommendation in what is termed the echo chamber. And remember, at the heart of it, interview processes mostly test interviewing skills and disadvantage people with cultural, cognitive, and communication differences. Being conscious of how bias can shape processes as well as individual behavior is important. What do you do when you observe bias? It really depends on your position and the context. There are occasions where bias must be called out, named and sanctioned publicly, and other occasions where it warrants being called in, a time for a one-on-one discussion to promote reflection and change. Checking unconscious biases and familiarizing yourself with microaggressions through tools like the Micropedia drives positive business outcomes and helps attract more talent, as Canadians are becoming more diverse and care more deeply about diversity and inclusion.